Today we will be discussing our findings on emojis and their influence on character perception.
Let us introduce ourselves. We are Group I in Professor Baker's noon Marketing 470 class.
My name is Lauren.
I'm Maddie.
Hi, I'm Brittany.
And I'm Danica.
In this research report, we study the perception of personality traits of the sender based off the Big Five personality traits model of the traits quarrelsomeness, extroversion, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience, and their prevalence due to the presence or absence of emojis in text message conversations. We also considered whether or not the gender of the receiver had an effect on their perception. We conducted primary research about our experimental group, which aligned our study with exploratory research design. We then used stratified sampling technique targeting college students ages 18 to 25 in order to get our sample population. Using Qualtrics, we created two different versions of our survey so we can compare the responses to our questions. The questionnaire showed respondents a text message conversation with or without emojis and asked respondents to rate their perception of the sender's personality traits. We then asked respondents to rate their own emoji usage. After we gathered significant data, we extracted the data using SPSS.
In a UK university study titled Emoticons and Impression Formation, Chris Fullwood and Orsolina Mortino exposed a controlled group of 18 to 24-year-old college students to an online computer-mediated chat conversation that was either supplemented by emoticons or not. They were then asked to rate their chat partner on a 10-item personality measure, which is a 10-item measure of the Big Five personality dimensions: extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to experience. Results indicated that gender differences of the participants influenced some of their ratings on certain variables, such as perceived emotional stability and extroversion. To keep up with the changing trend of digital communication usage from computers to smartphones, we aim to replicate and extend the study to the SDSU student body population by presenting a text messaging conversation on the screen of an iPhone rather than presenting a computer-mediated conversation.
So now we ask, does the absence or presence of emojis in a text message conversation on a smartphone device influence the receiver's perception of the sender's Big Five personality traits? And if so, which personality variables are influenced? And does gender identification influence these ratings?
Our collection of data primarily reflects the efforts of an exploratory research design. Our goal was to collect background information about our experimental group as well as determine what effects their background and experiences had on their responses regarding the use and absence of emojis in text messaging conversations. Specifically, we determined if a participant's gender had an effect on the answers they provided to us in regards to their text messaging experiences. This background and these experiences allowed us to further understand what focus group and how they perceive each other through text.
The bulk of our research technique revolved around a Qualtrics-made survey that entailed the exploratory theme questions that will result in our experimental group's opinions regarding the emojis. The questionnaire had questions and prompts that resulting in allowing us to make generalized conclusions about our experimental group's general perspective about personality traits within text messaging, and we may also be able to determine if those opinions are related to the gender of each participant.
These were the demographic questions asked in our survey. These were vital in narrowing down our respondents to within the 18 to 25 age range, whether or not they had a smartphone, and their gender. Gender was very important, as finding out the difference in male and female responses would be crucial in determining if gender really did have an effect on the perception of emojis in text messaging.
In the survey, we created the flow to randomly give participants a text message using or not using emojis. Depending on which text message they got, we wanted to clearly show the difference in perception of these two examples.
Participants were asked to look at the text message, which was either emoji or non-emoji, and answer the same questions about the extent to which they agreed or disagreed on a 7-point scale to the personality trait description. We used these 10 questions according to the 10-item personality measure. This was repeated for 10 questions, including extroverted, quarrelsome, dependable, anxious, openness to experiences, reserved, sympathetic, disorganized, calm, and conventional. These traits, when inputted into SPSS and someone reverse-coded, were able to tell us whether or not emojis influence people's perception of the sender.
In the final question, we asked participants to select which situations they use emojis in. This gave us an idea of the seriousness that emojis play and the frequency that some use emojis. We used this information from this portion of the survey to mostly get background information on the participants on how they rate their own emoji use.
Throughout our research, we used stratified sampling as our specific technique. We targeted college students ages 18 to 25, so we surveyed a large group of students specifically from SDSU. Within this group, we had hoped to have an equal number of men and women take our survey, but we ended up having a larger amount of females. In order to interpret our data more accurately, we weighted male and females differently, which fortunately SPSS did for us when we inputted our data set. As mentioned, we wanted to see if the opinions regarding emojis in text messaging are reflected off of gender, which as shown in our findings, gender did affect opinions regarding personality and emojis in text messages.
Our sample is intended to represent the SDSU student population. Though we targeted a certain age group, a substantial majority of the participants were 21 years old. Our sample population also consisted of both males and females. However, 71.86% of the population consisted of females, and 28.14% of our sample consisted of males. In our study, we identified two key independent variables that were necessary for our study. We observed whether or not the use of or absence of emojis in the controlled text message conversations had an impact on the participants' rating score, and whether being male or female had an impact on the rating scores as well. The total amount of counted participants after we cleaned our data was 96.
The key findings in our report revolve around the perceptions that people have of those who use emojis in text messages. We asked the question if emojis affect or do not affect a person's perception of a sender's personality traits and whether or not gender of the receiver influences these decisions. We found that in some cases emojis do influence perception in the cases of extroversion, neuroticism, and openness. In the cases of quarrelsomeness, which is the opposite of agreeableness, and conscientiousness, the scores only differed by a few decimal points. In general, the more emotional and outgoing personality traits were influenced by emojis more so than just pure anger, or less agreeableness, or general carefulness. We also found that on average, females scored higher on questions with or without emojis than men in almost all categories besides quarrelsomeness and neuroticism.
This chart shows how one of the 5 traits, extroversion, was predicted that would be affected by emojis. This chart shows that our hypothesis is correct and extroversion is clearly shown with a higher weighted average of 6.11 than with that of without emojis, which is 5.21.
This chart here shows an overall explanation of our findings of how emojis affect all 5 perceptions of text message senders. Our assumption was that emojis would have a large effect on personality perceptions. Our data shows that this is true for some personality traits, but not all of the 5 big personality traits that were tested. According to our hypothesis that emojis do have an effect on personality traits, and based on the average scores for emojis versus no emojis, the traits extroversion, neuroticism, and openness show clear evidence that supports our hypothesis due to their averages being higher than those of no emojis.
This bar chart gives an even more in-depth comparison of the emojis versus non-emojis, but narrowed down between how women and men compare in their ratings. This compares the average rating scores of male participants with an average rating scores of female participants, as well as whether or not they were shown the text message conversation with emojis or without emojis.
Our findings show that emojis do affect perception in a lot of cases and that these ratings can change based on the individual personality traits. We interpreted our findings from a marketer's or managerial insight by coming to the conclusion that the use of emojis can affect perception as well as not using emojis. The findings from each of the big 5 personality traits show that a person can be seen as extroverted or open, but if overused could potentially be seen as neurotic. We believe this shows that knowing the correct frequency of texting with emojis is important and can severely change the impressions people have on you when texting. We also found that females have a more acute awareness than males to the personality traits that are exerted by emojis, and this should also be considered when using emojis in text messaging.
Our key findings were in line with our hypothesis that the use of emojis in text conversations had an influence on the perceptions of the personality traits of the sender for the traits extroversion, neuroticism, and openness. We also found that females were more conscious and sensitive to the emoji use than males in all categories besides quarrelsomeness and neuroticism. If we had a larger sample, the 2 categories of quarrelsomeness and conscientiousness that had more equal results between emoji and non-emoji might have been more significantly different and further supported our hypothesis.
When texting somebody new, people may want to be aware that their use of emojis may influence their chat partner's impression of their personality, and certain personality traits may be perceived differently when using emojis based on the gender of your chat partner identifies as. There could be further research conducted on different contexts of emoji use in text messaging on a smartphone. Another study regarding how text messaging might influence one's perception of their chat partner's personality is whether having a green chat bubble versus a blue chat bubble might influence on an iPhone user's perception of their chat partner.
Thank you for listening. We hope you learned something new about emojis and their influence on character perception.